Very dramatic with the lights going out there. That was nice. All right, let me move this up a little bit so you can hear me. How's everybody doing? Thank you. I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. That's a good Wisconsin hello. It's nice to see a packed room on what is still, I think, a nice day. It wasn't raining when we came in here, so I appreciate you committing your nice summer afternoon, evening to be with me and us here tonight. I've got about an hour, and I'm going to try to do quite a bit of work with all of us. But I promise I want to leave at least a half hour at the end so we can have a good conversation and ask questions, because I can surely not cover everything that I want to do. All right, so I'm going to be talking for a lot for the next hour. But before I do, I want to start us off with a question, if you will allow me. All right. So, and please do it with me, all right? So close your eyes. Don't fall asleep. All right. Close your eyes. And I want you to imagine a Midwesterner. All right, so in your mind's eye, I want you to think of an individual, a person. Okay. Open them. Turn to the person sitting next to you and just describe what comes to mind when you imagine that Midwesterner. Go for it. All right, so I'll bring you back. If I could get some brave volunteers. Raise your hand, I'll try to spot you here from the front. When you think of a Midwesterner, who comes to mind? Yes, sir? Farmer. A farmer? All right, so our first person is a farmer. What else comes to mind? Yes? A teacher, all right. What else comes to mind? What does this person look like? White. Okay. Old, okay. All right. Hey, you said it, not me, all right? Yes, sir? John Turner, okay.
Overalls, he's big,
Okay, maybe wearing flannel underneath. Yeah, okay, all right. So farmer, overalls, flannel. All right. Anybody else? Al Capone, okay. There you go. All right, there's a twist. I haven't heard that one before. That's good. Yeah. Yes, sir? A factory worker, okay. All right. All right, so these are all different ideas. Different visages that come to mind, different identities that come to mind when we think of a Midwesterner. I want to tell a little bit of an origin story, and we'll come back to this idea of a Midwesterner in just a second. So I did all of my graduate school work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In fact, I did all my undergraduate and graduate school work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. My first career before I was an educator at the higher education level was I was a middle school teacher. So I taught dual language immersion education to 6th, 7th, and 8th graders all in the same classroom, and I taught social studies and science and Spanish and in English at the same time. So that was the hardest job I've ever done in my life. Anything after that is a cakewalk, all right? But I decided I wanted to go back to graduate school, and I wanted to pursue an advanced degree in history. Now, when you decide to go to graduate school, and especially as a historian, you have to pick the topic that you're going to focus on, and it better be something that you really love, because you're going to be doing it for the next 6 to 8 years of your life. All right, it took me 6 years to do my master's and my PhD. And you really got to love this, right? You're going to be super focused on this topic for the next nearly decade of your life. So I knew that I wanted to study the history of my family. My parents are both originally from Jalisco, Mexico. They came here at different times in the 20th century. My dad's family came in the early 60s. My mom's family came in the late 70s. And they both settled here in Wisconsin. So I wanted to go to school to study, to write an entire dissertation on this very central question. Why in the heck did they come here, of all places? Why Wisconsin? Why not Texas or California or Arizona or somewhere where there are larger, more established ethnic Mexican populations? So this was the goal, right? I was going to write the definitive history of Mexicans, of Latinos in Wisconsin. Summer of 2013 was my first summer I got to jump into the archives. And it's kind of a big deal for a young graduate student. You get to get, elbow deep in the material that's going to help you tell the story of this history that you want to tell. So my first archives trip was to the Milwaukee County Historical Society, summer of 2013. I had set the entire summer aside to live in this space. I went to the archivist that first day, doe-eyed, bushy-tailed. I was super excited, right? I went to the archivist and I said, I want you to give me everything that your historical society has preserved on Mexicans in Milwaukee or Mexicans in Wisconsin. Now, mind you, I had set aside the entire summer to dig into these archives. The archivist goes into the back room, and at the Milwaukee County Historical Society, it's in an old bank, so he literally goes into the vault. And he comes back and puts 3 boxes on the table and says, there you go. 3 boxes, banker's boxes, 3 boxes. Something I could get through in probably half a day. So I was crestfallen. I was completely distraught. I was thinking, there's no way I can write a dissertation if this is the material I have to work with. So I got over that initial sense of shock, and I opened up the first box. And I want to show you all the first document that I pulled out of the archives on that first trip. Can I show it to you? Okay. Okay. So let's do some document work, as if we're in a social studies classroom. Turn to the person sitting next to you. What do you see? Anything that comes to mind. Break down what this archival piece is. All right, go for it. '87. All right, so let's get some observations. What do you see? What do you see in this document, the first archival document I pulled out of the box? Family, okay, good. We see a family. What else? We see women, okay, you counted the women, right? So we have mostly women. What else?
Probably a church steps.
Yep, all right, so probably a church, you're right. Happy, good. A baptism, so some sort of sacramental celebration, perhaps? Any other guesses? Okay, they all look white. Any other observations? All right, so you ready for this? That baby? That's me. Yeah. I kid you not. I mean, I couldn't make this story up, right? The first document that I pull out of the archives, on my first archival trip for my dissertation, I literally find myself in my research, right? I've changed a little bit, yeah. Just a little bit. I mean, so my parents are humble. They have this somewhere tucked away in a closet. I haven't seen it in years. This is the first thing I pull out. All right, so let's put our historian's hat on and think about what this document actually means, beyond the fact, existentially, that I'm literally seeing myself in my research, right? All right, so let me see if this works here. All right, so first, this is the Milwaukee Journal magazine. This is the Sunday insert for the Milwaukee Journal, which was the paper of record for Milwaukee. And so this is their feature piece. It's from the summer of 1987. I was born in April, so this picture was probably taken in May or early June. I'm a little baby. There's my mom. There's my dad. Those are my tias, our aunts. We are walking out of a church. That is Our Lady of Guadalupe Church on the south side of Milwaukee. It is the heart of Latino Catholicism in the city. You're right. The faces are happy, right? But I got to looking at the chyron, the script at the bottom of the front page of this newspaper. And I got to thinking, what does it mean that the paper of record for the city of Milwaukee says that this is the beating heart of Hispanic Milwaukee in 1987? That this image represents what this community is. And so it was this picture that got me started on my dissertation project. So for the next 6 years of my life, I was able to find more documents. I had to make some of them myself through oral history recovery and going into people's homes and asking them for their things and donating them to historical societies. But I got to thinking, what does it mean that the pulse of Hispanic Milwaukee are these families walking out of a church on a Sunday morning? And so for the next 6 years, I worked on this project to better understand how Latino communities have made community space within religious sites, within houses of worship. But not just places of building community, also places where they have built social movements. When at times across the 20th century, they haven't felt fully at home in the new spaces that are their home here in Wisconsin. So this image is what I think of when I think of a Midwesterner. I think of my family, who settled here at different times in the 20th century. I think of my cousins, who are probably about half of the ethnic Mexican population on the city south side. All right, that's how it works, right? Somebody shows up, you send word back home, you say there's work here, there's opportunities, and more people follow you. So here's something I want us to take away from our time together today. This is from Suke Vega, who's an anthropologist who wrote a beautiful book about Latino Indiana. And she reminds us that the imagined Midwest is far from reality. This idea of the Midwest that we have is only one idea of the Midwest. There are many different ways of understanding this region, a place that many different communities have called home. And so over the last, 2012 is when I started my dissertation, so over the last 12 years or so, this is what I've been working on. When I was in grad school, I published my first book called Mexicans in Wisconsin, which is a very quick introduction about a history of ethnic Mexicans who have come to Wisconsin over the last few decades to make a home for themselves. I told you I worked on that dissertation. That dissertation just got published a few months ago. It's my second book, called Strangers No Longer, Latino Belonging and Faith in 20th Century Wisconsin. And I'm really proud of this book, not just because it's a 500-page dissertation that I turned into a 300-page book. That's finally out in the world, right? It's like the labor of love that I've been working on forever. I'm also proud of the cover page. It's done by a local artist in Milwaukee. And I want you to look at the corner. I put my family on the cover page as a reminder of this history. All right. So I have to do a little bit of work with you. I'm going to try to do a very fast run through a very long history. But before we get started, I have a quiz. All right? It's a quiz. Quick question. It's just one question to get some primary understanding to see where we're starting from, okay? All right, so here's the question that I have for you. When did the first Latino immigrants settle in Wisconsin? A, 1848, B, 1884, C, 1920, or D, 1945? Turn to the person sitting next to you. Whisper what you think it is. All right, let's do a straw poll real quick. Raise your hand if you think it's A, 1848. All right. Raise your hand if you think it's B, 1884. All right. C, 1920. All right. And D, 1945. Okay, the correct answer. And there's no prizes unless... Oh, no? No prizes. No prizes. Sorry. All right. The correct answer is 1884. Congratulations. All right. Some of you went with the founding of the state. That's a good guess, too. 1848. But the correct answer is 1884. A brief introduction here. I want to introduce you to the first recorded ethnic Latino who settled in the state of Wisconsin. That doesn't mean he's the first ever, but that's the one that we can track, right? That we have archival documentation on, that we can say for sure was here. This man right here, look at that beautiful mustache. I have tried, impossible, I can't do it, all right? It just wasn't meant to be. This man, his name is Rafael Valles. He was born in the state of Puebla, Mexico in 1863. And from a young age, Rafael demonstrated a real aptitude for music. He was a bit of a prodigy. And he was a young man in the 1880s. He was living in Mexico City, not too far away from his hometown in Puebla. And he was working with a local orchestra in Mexico City. Back in the 19th century, American opera companies would sometimes do tours of Latin American countries. And there was an opera company from the United States called the C.D. Hess Opera Company. They were coming through Mexico City, and they asked for local artists to sit in and perform with them while they were exhibitioning their work in Mexico. Young Rafael Valles jumped in with them, and at the end of his time with them, he decided to continue to come with them to the United States. So he jumped on board. He followed them to the U.S. He did a tour through the U.S., and for some reason that I've never been able to figure out why, he decided to settle here in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee, in 1884. And he made a really good life for himself. He became the organist and the choir director for some of the largest synagogues and churches in the city of Milwaukee. He became a personal music instructor for the city's elite. He joined local politics, joined the Democratic Party in Milwaukee in the 1890s. And, most importantly for me, he became Marquette University's first Latino professor at the turn of the century. He was a professor of music, taught some classes at Marquette. Now, Rafael's story is fascinating for many different reasons. One, because it places the history of Latinos all the way in the 19th century here in Wisconsin. But it's also fascinating because in some ways his story is an outlier from many of the stories we're going to talk about today. The overwhelming majority of people who have come to Wisconsin from Latin America over the last 100, 150 years, 130 years, have not come from as vaulted economic and educational positions as Rafael. Because when he arrived here in Milwaukee in the 1880s, there wasn't a Latino population, so he basically integrated himself. And in some ways, the archives tell us that he passed as Spanish. Because to be Mexican at the early 20th century, as we're going to see in a moment, wasn't always such a good marker here in the state of Wisconsin. He lived most of his life as any other immigrant Milwaukeean. He married a German-American woman, Mary Schoen. They had 3 children. They lived in the suburbs of Milwaukee, not in Milwaukee proper as they got older. And they never really connected with the Mexican community that comes afterwards. But his story matters because it's the first. And it's a reminder, as we're going to see today, that if we leave knowing nothing else from our time here tonight, Latinos are not newcomers to Wisconsin. We have been here for over 100 years. And we have found ways to make homes for ourselves in all parts of the state, everywhere from Milwaukee to Door County to Watoma to places today like Arcadia, Wisconsin, all across the state. And we'll get to that at the end of our time together. So my work with us today is pretty large. I am trying to, in the next, let's say, 45 minutes or so, get through about 100 years of history. So again, there's no way I can do this comprehensively. If you have questions, jot them down. We'll get to them at the end of our time together. Rafael Valles arrives in the 1880s. I said he's a bit of an outlier because for the next about 40 years, there's not many Mexicans who come to Wisconsin. In Milwaukee, in the 1910 census, only 50 Latinos, 50 Mexicans, in fact, called the city home, 50 in 1910. But then something happens in the 1920s. In the 1920s, Congress, at the federal level, decides to pass a series of immigration laws, 1917, 1921, and 1924. And these immigration laws functionally shut off immigration from Europe. At this point, Americans, many Americans, are becoming a little bit squeamish, a little bit anxious about all those Europeans who have been arriving in large numbers from places like Italy and Poland and Russia. These people, some Americans believe, look different, act different, speak different, practice their faith different, in such a way that perhaps they can never become Americans. Some Americans are worried about the changing national character of the country. And so they ask their congressmen to shut the border down. And that's what Congress does in 1921 and 1924. They pass the Immigration Quota Acts. They functionally end all immigration, down to a trickle, from the place that had been sending hundreds of thousands of people every single year. When they do that, however, they're not just removing people from the equation, they're also removing something else. That's right, workers. So Congress understands that they still need cheap labor to come to the U.S. They know this because industrialists and agriculturalists are petitioning, they're lobbying their congressmen to remind them of that. And so in those same laws, when they pass these immigration quotas on Eastern and Southern Europe, they leave the Western Hemisphere completely open. They place no restriction on the number of people who can come from Canada, but that's not really what we're talking about here. They place no restriction on the number of people who can come from Mexico. And so beginning in the 1920s, companies that had traditionally looked to Europe for labor start to look south to Mexico. So I'll tell you about one of them, the Pfister and Vogel Tannery. Some of you may know that Milwaukee at the turn of the century was the #1 tanning city in the entire world. It was the tanning capital of the entire world. And that work, anybody ever done tanning work? It's disgusting work, right? I mean, you're taking cowhides, you're passing them through caustic chemicals, smells nasty, so you can make nice leather that can be sold at market. So that used to be the work of Serbians and Poles and Slovakians and different groups from Eastern Europe. The Pfister and Vogel Tannery had 3 different plants in Milwaukee. They were humongous, and they needed new workers. So they sent labor recruiters in 1920 down to central Mexico. In Spanish, these labor recruiters are called enganchistas. That means in Spanish to hook, enganchar. They were going down there to hook men to come up to Milwaukee. Now here's the thing. Mexico had just completed a very traumatic 7-year Revolutionary War. Had functionally devastated the nation. Right? Economically, it was in really bad shape. So you had these young men living all across Mexico who needed jobs. So they would take whatever opportunity they could get. So the Pfister and Vogel sends their labor recruiters, enganchistas, down to places like Jalisco, where my family's from. And these men, these enganchistas, would show up with contracts. Anybody want to guess what language those contracts were in? That's right. 6-month term contracts, and they would have them sign their name, jump on a train, like this one right here, and make their way northward to Milwaukee. There was one minor detail that companies like Pfister and Vogel did not mention to those young Mexican men, however. Milwaukee had one of the most heavily unionized workforces in the country at the time. And at that time, when they went to get these workers in 1920, they were engaged in a labor strike with their unionized workforce. So they had gone down to Mexico, that's right, to get strike breakers, to get scabs. So these men get off at the train depot in Milwaukee, and they're not expecting necessarily a parade or a welcoming wagon, but they're also not expecting those striking tannery workers waiting for them with bats in their hand, ready to bash their heads in. So the first interaction that the first Mexicans who settled in Milwaukee in large numbers have with the state is that these people are coming here to do what? Take our jobs. It was so bad that the Pfister and Vogel tannery actually put these men up in cots inside the tannery walls. So just imagine working like 12-hour days, 14-hour days in a tannery, smelling this, and this is where you have to live. They actually brought in the YMCA to do English classes, recreational activities, because they were afraid that if they let them out on the south side of Milwaukee, that'd be a bad investment. Yeah, they'd get killed. So that's the first interaction that Mexicans have with the city of Milwaukee, and that's the first interaction that Wisconsinites have with Mexicans. Now you might say to yourself, well, they were sold a false bill of goods. There's no way they stuck around. But the situation economically was so bad in Mexico that these people were desperate. And these young men, and they were all young men at the beginning because they were coming here to do this industrial labor, continue to come to Milwaukee. So first it was train loads, and then the people stuck around and they sent word back to Mexico, to their home pueblos, to their home communities, send more guys, there's work here. All right, it's not great work, but we're getting paid and it's more stable labor that we can get back home. And pretty soon, this community that had signed these groups of men that signed 6-month contracts, stuck around for a year, 2 years, 3 years. And it wasn't just men, they would send word back down to Mexico, and they'd bring their families up. So remember, I mentioned that in 1910, there were about 50 Mexicans who called the city of Milwaukee home. By the end of the 1920s, there was anywhere from 3,000 to 7,000 people. And it's really hard to track the numbers. That's about what we have, 3,000 to 7,000 ethnic Mexicans who lived, most of them on the south side of Milwaukee. All right, so remember, when Congress passed these laws in the early 1920s, the promise was they were going to cut off that immigration of people who looked different, sounded different, practiced their faith differently. But now, you got this growing group of people that are not just here for jobs. They're sticking around for the long term. In fact, when Congress passed these immigration laws and left the opening to Mexico, legislators referred to Mexicans as birds of passage. They're like those birds that migrate north and south according to the seasons. You know, they're just going to go back after they finish their contract. But they're not going back. They're sticking around. So now there's thousands of Mexicans living on the south side of Milwaukee. And Milwaukeeans are curious, anxious, a little bit angry. They're thinking maybe these people might try to stick around and become Wisconsinites. So in 1930, the International Institute, which is a settlement house on the city's south side, they had served immigrants for generations. Right? Walker's Point, where many of them arrived in the 1920s, was considered the Ellis Island of the city. Right? It was kind of the receiving point for immigrants since the 1850s. The International Institute in 1930 sends out a social worker onto the city's south side to try to get the beat. What's going on with these people? Who are these people? What can we teach the rest of the city about this growing Mexican population? And in 1930, they published a report. It's published by a social worker named Agnes Fenton. I want to share a little bit of it with you. In 1930, Agnes Fenton published a report called the Mexicans of the City of Milwaukee, and it said this: do you know how intimate an American problem the Mexican has become? So this is just 10 years after the first trainloads of Mexicans have been recruited. Mind you, they have been invited into the city, into the state. And just a decade later, they are now a problem. So you might want to ask yourselves, what is the problem that they present? Let's go to the source. While the social workers are afraid that the peons will not mix with our native population, the eugenicists are afraid that they will. It is certain that interbreeding cannot be prevented. That might be considered a happy ending if the quality of our racial stock were not lowered in the process. If the stock of the Mexican is as good as ours, there can be no scientific objection. But there are, however, competent and impartial observers who consider the peon inferior to the whites, both physically and mentally. Bless you. So take a second, just turn to the person sitting next to you. What is the problem that these Mexicans pose for the city of Milwaukee? Go for it. Try to break it down amongst yourselves. Bless you. All right, so what is the problem? According to Agnes Fenton, working for the YWCA's International Institute, what is the problem that this new immigrant population poses for the city of Milwaukee? What's that? Yeah, it's a breeding problem, right? Certainly a breeding problem, but what's specific? It's not an overbreeding problem. They're not worried about that.
Color of their skin.
Yeah, interbreeding. They're worried about a term that may have used in the 1930s, miscegenation, right? They're worried about the mixing of these different groups. And as Agnes Fenton notes, citing eugenics, which is, of course, a pseudoscience that was popular during this period, the problem here is that Mexicans represent a lower racial stock. And if they intermix with the city's white population, they will lower the racial stock of the entire city. So remind you, this is not Agnes Fenton, the crackpot on Twitter. This is Agnes Fenton, a social worker working for the leading immigrant settlement house in the city of Milwaukee. This was the predominant way of thinking about this new immigrant population. And so the reality was that even though they'd been recruited to the city in the 1920s, they found it very hard to find spaces where they felt at home in their new home. But just like immigrants before them, just like those Germans and Poles and Italians and Irish who had come before them, Mexicans who arrived in Milwaukee had to turn inward to make their own institutions to feel like they belonged. So they did things like create their own mutual aid societies. La Sociedad Mutualista Hispano-Azteca, which is formed in 1929 and was the first Mexican mutual aid society in Wisconsin. Bless you. Take a look at this picture. You have, of course, photographs in the 1920s, big deal. So they're all dressed to the nines. This is a celebration for Mexican Independence Day. You have the Mexican flag over here in the corner. You have the banner representing their organization right there in the middle. But there's another image in the back, the American flag. So you see a people who is trying to navigate their space in their new homes. Are they Mexican? Are they American? Are they something in between? They're not really sure. They did things like open up their own grocery stores. So this is Milwaukee's, this is Wisconsin's first Mexican grocery store. Luciano Aro, who had arrived as one of those original recruits from the Pfister and Vogel tannery, he had saved every penny that he could so that he wouldn't have to work at the tannery anymore. And he opened up a grocery store on 5th and National, which is then Grove and National Street on the south side of Milwaukee, so that he could sell his community the things that they missed from back home. They did things like create their own baseball teams. All right, so this is Wisconsin's first Mexican baseball team, established in the early 1930s. They have the best name for a baseball team, the Friends. All right, so win or lose, they have a good time. This is also taken on the south side of Milwaukee, right on 5th and National, in front of those old storefronts. And then, important to my research, they established their own religious institutions. And in fact, interestingly enough, the church is the only place where they find a sense of fellowship with white Milwaukeeans. Their shared Catholicism serves as a bridge. All right, it's a space where their shared faith can bring them together. They, with the help of the Milwaukee Catholic Archdiocese, they purchased an old storefront building on the south side of Milwaukee and Walker's Point. Those pews are donated from Marquette University. The community paints the inside of the walls to make it look like a traditional chapel in Mexico. And it becomes the hub of religious and political life in the city through most of the 20s and the 1930s. And then, of course, they also have their own celebrations, often in public spaces as well. This is Wisconsin's first Mexican Independence Day parade in the Bayview neighborhood, which is right south of the Walker's Point. And I want to point out a few things. Of course, the long procession of cars. There's the Mexican flag. But again, the American flag, as these people are trying to navigate their place in their new homes. All right, so this Mexican population grows through the early 20th century. In the 1940s and 1950s, they're joined by Puerto Ricans who are not immigrants. They are migrants, American citizens, who after World War II begin arriving as recruited industrial workers. So they come for the exact same reasons that Mexicans do. They're looking for better economic opportunities. But the difference is they don't have any citizenship issues. They don't have any immigration problems because they're migrants. They can travel freely between the island and their new home here in Milwaukee. That's a small population that grows on the northeast side of Milwaukee. Then everything changes in the 1940s and 1950s. And it's not because of immigration. It's because of migration. In the 1940s and 1950s, specifically after the end of World War II, Wisconsin becomes, and some of you probably know this, being here in central Wisconsin, Wisconsin becomes one of the leading agricultural states in the nation. It in fact is, through most of the mid-20th century, the #1 canning state in the entire United States, canning of fruits and vegetables. Now, how do you become the #1 canning state in the nation? You need workers. After World War II, after all that production to get ready for the wartime period, these farms were still humming, and they needed workers to do that work. And a lot of farmers in Wisconsin, as in the Midwest, in places like Minnesota and Michigan, look south. Not to Mexico, not for Mexican immigrants, but to Texas. Texas Mexicans, or Tejanos, American citizens born in the United States of ethnic Mexican background, who would leave their homes in the Borderlands region, right here on the edge, and travel all across the United States to harvest and sow everything that you can imagine. So basically any crop, any type of crop that was being grown here in Wisconsin, in some capacity had Mexican hands working on them. Not every single farm, mind you, but every single type of product that was being produced had some form of Mexican labor in some capacity. Whether it was the cucumbers here in the pickle belts of Wisconsin or the cherry orchards. Here you have the Almanderes family from Carrizo Springs, who every single year beginning in the early 1950s would make their way to Wisconsin in the springtime. They time it right after school ended. Kids would jump in with the family into the trucks and they'd make their way northward. They'd often hit up different harvests in places like Missouri and in Illinois before they made it to Wisconsin. And then they would hop around the state following the crops as they came up. A few things to point out. Migrant labor in the 1950s was family work. Families came up together because who's going to stay in Texas and look after the kids, right? Everyone's got to come up. But not just for childcare reasons. Everybody needed to be working to help to provide for the family's economy. So basically, if you could stand, you were in the fields helping to work. So I want us to think about the Almanderes family right here. They were part of the 15,000 Texas Mexicans who came up to Wisconsin every single year in the 1950s. 15,000. By the end of the 1950s, Texas Mexican labor made up 80% of the migrant farm workers in the state. Overwhelmingly Mexican American. So I want us to think about a family like this. This is the Almanderes family from Carrizo Springs in the early 1960s. I want us to think about a family like the Almanderes family in 1949 in Fond du Lac County, right south of us, all right? In 1949, a family like this one, after a long, hot day of working in the fields of Wisconsin, decided they wanted some recreation. Now, mind you, these are poor families. There's a reason why they are doing this type of work. So the only place they could have recreation for the kids was the local pool. So in 1949, in Waupun, Wisconsin, a family like this one goes to the local pool, hoping for an opportunity to cool off after a long day of work. And this is what they find. Summer 1949, the park custodian, Seymour Patrick, sees this Texas-Mexican family approaching the pool, and he denies the family entry. He tells the families that the white Waupun residents don't want their children in the same pool with the Mexicans because these kids are going to spread tuberculosis, and they don't even speak English. Anybody want to guess what happens to that park custodian? Gets promoted. Any other guesses? He gets beat up. One of my favorite is when people assume he maybe gets elected mayor the next year. Seymour Patrick is fired the very next day. Is it because Waupun is a very progressive part of Wisconsin? No. Not any more progressive than any other part of the state in the 1940s. Why does Seymour Patrick get fired the next day? Yes, in the back.
The local industry needs workers.
There it is. In the 1940s and 1950s, migrant farm workers represented the last vestiges of indentured servitude, of slavery in this country. Commission after commission at the local, state, and federal level tracked the destitute positions that these people lived and worked under. Both President Truman and President Eisenhower had multiple federal blue ribbon commissions assigned to task of figuring out why it was that these people continued to live in these terrible conditions. These reports refer to migrant farm workers as the displaced persons of America, stateless citizens, the most forgotten and neglected people in our land, and the stepchildren of the nation. But they had one thing at their disposal. They may have been politically disenfranchised and economically disadvantaged, but they had one power. That was the power of their feet. Because every single spring when they got into their trucks, they got to decide where those trucks were pointed, where they were going to commit their labor for the next few months of their life. So Seymour Patrick gets fired because the farmers know that in Waupun. They make sure that he doesn't have a job before the end of the week. Throughout the 1950s, the state recognized these people were essential workers, but they also recognized that many Wisconsinites did not want them in their state. And we saw editorials like this pop up throughout the 1950s. This is from the Milwaukee Sentinel. An editorial from the Milwaukee Sentinel, the editors write, "Migrant crews which swarm into Wisconsin by the thousands are an economic asset to the state and make the difference between success and failure in many of our harvesting operations. They give us valuable service and deserve decent treatment while they are giving it." So here you have one of the leading newspapers in the state pleading with Wisconsinites to treat these people better. And on its face, you might say, well, that's awfully swell of them. That's nice of the newspaper to plead with the state to be more hospitable to these people. But I want us to focus in on this bolded section here. It's a reflexive sentence. It's an if-then sentence. If they give us valuable service, then we should treat them well. But let's flip that on its head. What happens if they don't give us a valuable service? What happens if their labor is no longer necessary? What happens if they're no longer economically essential? How should the state treat these people? Then we can dump them. That's right. So this is the question, the vacillation that happens throughout much of the 20th century and how state institutions and sometimes communities build a relationship with people coming from Texas and Latin America. They give us a valuable service and deserve treatment, decent treatment while they are giving it. It's a complicated way to extend a welcoming hand to a group of people. So remember, displaced persons of America, stateless citizens, the most forgotten and neglected people in our land, the stepchildren of America. So in Waupun, Seymour Patrick is fired the next day, and the Waupun community recognized they have to do something to show a better face that this is not who Wapan is. So over the next few years, the local community comes together, civic and religious organizations, and they put together a series of different projects. This one's called the Wapan Migrant Project. You can kind of see in some of these images what they were doing, right? They have kind of like day camps for some of the kids, and the families are very cautious. They're like, what the heck's going on? I'm not sending my kid with you guys. But anyway, so they try, right? They do it in the park. They have classes. They hold dances where they try to have the local Wapan residents, intermingle with some of these Texas Mexicans. They refer to these as fiestas and fandangos. All right? And don't you know it, that in the early 1950s, Wapan solved racism. They did it. They fixed the problem completely in 1950. That's what this article says from 1950. A year ago, Wapan had a race problem, but it's all over. Now, obviously, you know that Wapan had not fixed the issue with these Band-Aids, these programs, these outreach efforts, because fundamentally what they had not reckoned with, what they had not wrestled with, was the very labor systems that were putting these people into these economic situations. State commissions continue to report throughout the 1950s that Texas Mexicans lived in what one report referred to as hovels that defy description. All right? This is what some of these places looked like that the people were arriving in. This is in Plymouth. Now, this place at least has a roof and windows. But most of the places that people lived in didn't have running water or electricity. Some of them were repurposed barracks, shacks. This is in 1969, 20 years after that incident in Wapan. This was the shared sanitation space for the entire camp. And some of the most heartbreaking things when I engage in oral histories or read reports is not just the conditions, it's the lack of dignity that's available in these spaces. So remember that I told you that these were family units that were arriving. Imagine having to share these open stalls, these open shower stalls. A child with their grandmother, type of privacy, any sort of individual space for themselves. So the response from local communities isn't cutting it because they're not addressing the fundamental issue. And it's not really until the 1960s that things begin to change. And it's not because of the local impetus of communities. It is because of the migrants themselves who begin to organize into labor unions. In 1966, the first migrant farm worker union in the Midwest is formed in Watoma, Wisconsin. Formed by a young man whose family had been coming to Wisconsin for decades. At the time, he was a college student at University at Oshkosh. He's right there. He is 20 years old. His name is Jesus Salas. His family had been coming for years to Wisconsin. He knew firsthand these conditions. And in 1966, he heard about these farm workers in California who were forming a union. People like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta forming an organization like the United Farm Workers. And he said, we should do that here in Wisconsin too. So in 1966, they formed their organization called Obreros Unidos, or Workers United. And they staged a dramatic march from the Watoma Courthouse to Madison. And they call it a march for respectability. Yes, they want better wages. Yes, they want better working conditions. But fundamentally, they want to be respected as human beings. And as Americans. You see there again that American flag at the front of their march, reminding everyone that they work here in this country and they are American citizens. This movement that starts in central Wisconsin, this effort to kind of build a sense of dignity for Mexican Americans and ethnic Mexicans who are growing all across the state, moves from the rural parts of the state and it moves into cities like Madison and Oshkosh and Milwaukee. A lot of these kids, and they are like late teens, early 20s, a lot of these organizers who are hitting the streets are activated by the Black freedom struggle, the Black civil rights movement that is, of course, sweeping the nation. By the late 1960s, Milwaukee has become a hotbed for civil rights activism. It's earned the moniker of the Selma of the North because of 200 nights of consecutive open housing marches led by Father Grappi and the Young Commandos. And these young Mexican Americans and the young Puerto Ricans who join them as well want to fight for similar things for their communities. Some of those young Mexican Americans call themselves Chicanos, which is a political identity, trying to grapple with the fact that they're Mexican and American at the same time and looking for political rights in this country. These communities begin to grow all across Wisconsin, and those movements ripple across the state. Those migrant farm workers by the late 1960s and early 1970s start to settle out of the migrant stream because of mechanization. So there are fewer jobs in the fields. There's still people who need places to live and places to work. And they start to settle all across the state of Wisconsin, including in places like here in Waupaca, which begin to have significant, although small, but significant Mexican-American populations beginning in the 1960s and especially in the early 1970s. And a lot of the people who settle in places like Watoma and Appleton and Oshkosh and Waupaca are former migrant farm workers who have been coming to the state for decades, but no longer have an opportunity to have agricultural work, and so they look for different types of jobs. They settle in places here. This is in Appleton. They form organizations like La Raza Unida. So you can see kind of here the militant nature of their activism. You see that Thunderbird, which represents the United Farm Workers and farm worker activism. You see these young people who are wrestling with the idea of the American melting pot and why it is that they're not being invited to be a part of that integration or assimilation. And they publish manifestos. They're just trying to find their place in this new place that's home, but that doesn't always feel like home. So these communities, Mexican, ethnic Mexican, so Mexican immigrant, Mexican American, Puerto Rican, a small number of Cubans, a small number of Central Americans, begin to grow in the 1980s all across the state in 1990s. And I'll show you what that looks like numerically across the state. So in 1980 in the state of Wisconsin, there are about 63,000 Latinos who called the state home. In 1990, it goes up a little bit by about 30,000 to 93,000. And then something happens here. From 1990 to 2000, that number more than doubles. The Latino population grows from 93,000 to over 190,000. And that number has continued to skyrocket since the turn of the 21st century. Any guesses what happens here from 1990 to 2000 to make that population more than double in just a decade? Any guesses? Strife in their home countries, yep, that's part of it. Any other guesses? What's that? Cheap labor, right? That's a continuous theme throughout the 20th century, yeah. What's that? UMOs, right? So actually UMOs is coming around the 60s, 70s. They're helping those displaced migrant farm workers move into industrial spaces. So they're not recruiting people. They're helping the people who are already here find new lives. What happens most dramatically between 1990 and 2000 is it is a bit of strife in home country, but it's economic strife. Remember that in 1994, the United States signs a trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. This was a free trade agreement that was supposed to abolish borders for business, right? So no tariffs between these three countries, no taxes for goods. They may have gotten rid of borders for capital, but they did not get rid of borders for people. So corn coming in from Iowa can now be sold in Mexico for cheaper than it is for a Mexican farmer to grow it in his own farm. So the corn industry in Mexico is absolutely decimated. So you have people in Mexico in the 1990s who have nowhere to go. So where do they go? They come northward. You see in the early 1990s through the early 2000s an explosion of undocumented immigration, not just to Wisconsin, but across the United States. Questions aside. I'll get you. Yeah, go ahead. You want to take it right now?
Well, I'm just trying to tie this in. Wasn't there a major currency devaluation about that time?
Yeah.
That played a role?
There were multiple currency devaluations in the 80s and 90s. And so you start to see, that's why you see that growth beginning in that period, yes. So it is a number of economic factors that is spurring people northward looking for economic opportunities. All right? And this is what it looks like in Wisconsin. In 1990, this was the distribution of Latinos across the state. Not just Mexicans, but Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and not just Mexican immigrants, but anybody who identified as ethnic Latino in some way, okay? So in 1990, the population of Latinos was predominantly in the southeast part of the state, the place where they had been arriving for most of the 20th century. Right? So there's Madison, there's Milwaukee, Waukesha, Racine, Kenosha. Those are the major hubs. That's 1990. It's 2014. You see these communities spreading out all across the state. And this is what, I'm going to show you a different graph. The metrics are a bit different. So this shows the number of people. The next one is going to show the percentage of change. So this was 1990. This was 2014. And the next one is going to show you the percentage of change per county according to the 2020 census. Every single county except for Menominee, every single county saw a growth in its Latino population. Every single county, including Wapaka. Every single county. And the fastest growth is not happening in the southeast part of the state. The fastest growth is happening basically everywhere else. Every single county in Wisconsin witnessed a growth in its Latino population in the last few decades. Latinos, according to the 2020 census, are now the largest minority in the state, about 9% of the state's population. They represent in almost every single county the only demographic growth. Some of you may have heard that the state's population is declining in nearly every single county. The only places that we see demographic growth are ethnic Asian Americans and ethnic Latino Americans. And just to throw one more twist at you, I want to see what this looks like across different counties. So the top 5, Brown, Kenosha, Milwaukee, Racine, Dane, are the places where Latinos have been coming for decades. Milwaukee is the hub, right? So you have now over 136,000 Latinos in Milwaukee County. In the state, there's over 500,000 Latinos who call Wisconsin home. That's interesting, but I am more interested in these places. Fond du Lac, Dorr, Kewanee, or Trempealeau. Y'all know where Trempealeau is? Western part of the state, right along the Mississippi. All right? So you think about a place like Arcadia. Anybody ever been to Arcadia? If you were to go to Arcadia today and drive downtown Arcadia, Main Street Arcadia, you would see Mexican grocery stores and Mexican barber shops and Mexican panaderias. If you go to the Arcadia Elementary School, the kindergarten classes are now majority Latino. Look at Arcadia in 1990. 53 Latinos called Trempealeau home, the entire county in 1990. These are significant and dramatic changes that are happening in a very short amount of time. Right? Within the span of a few decades, these populations are booming. And I'm going to add one more factor on top of it. For the last 100 years, the majority population that was coming to Wisconsin was ethnic Mexican. Mexican American, or Mexican immigrants. Today, the largest growth is not coming from Mexico. It's coming from Nicaragua and Venezuela and Guatemala. Over the last few years, the people who are coming from Latin America or from Latino places are not the same as what they were before. Here in Wapaka, the largest populations are not from not from Mexico. They're coming from Nicaragua and Venezuela. So these are dramatic changes happening like at the split second, right? They are happening very, very quickly. And one question we might ask ourselves, I think we should ask ourselves after this discussion about 100 years of settlement in the state, is how are Wisconsinites reacting? And then most recently, just this year, this is an active situation that's being worked out. Some of you may have heard about it in Whitewater. Whitewater that has seen a huge increase in its Nicaraguan and Venezuelan population over the last year. People arriving, some of them are asylum seekers. And we were talking about earlier, I was talking with a group earlier here today about immigration law, which is, of course, after financial law, like the most complicated form of law in the United States. I mean, you could just take asylum applications and asylum law in this country, which is just so interwoven and so complex that I would need hours to explain it to you, and I couldn't do it because I'm not a professional on it. But you have people arriving from Venezuela and Nicaragua who have applied for asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border, They have received court dates, but of course those court dates go out for 6 years right now. That's the backlog. And the thing is that some of these asylum applications, you're not allowed to work while you are in the application system. So you're in the United States, you don't have work authorization while you wait to have your case adjudicated. And the question becomes, what do you do? How do you survive? How do you feed your family? And that's what's happening in Whitewater. You have large populations arriving not from Mexico, but from these places where people are fleeing economic deprivation or violence. And there aren't services in place to support them. In a place like Whitewater, which has not had a very large Latino population or immigrant or refugee population over the last few decades. You also see it in the way in which the state has responded to these populations over the last decade. So I'm reminded here in February of 2016 when the state legislature was considering a slate of proposals, a slate of laws that would have deputized local law enforcement, police officers and sheriffs, to function as an arm of immigration and customs enforcement. That means that if a police officer stopped somebody for a broken taillight or for running a stop sign, they would have to ask their papers, their immigration status, and they would be forced to hold that person in detention to hand over to the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration, and Customs Enforcement. So there are two pieces of legislation in front of the legislator in February of 2016. And in response, 20,000 Wisconsinites went to Madison. 20,000 Wisconsinites, not just immigrants, but their friends, their families, their communities. White, black, Latino, Asian, all together in this space. And you know what? Those laws didn't even make it into the Senate. They didn't even make it to Governor Walker's desk. The romantic might say, wow, 20,000 people with a unified voice stopped these draconian laws from being passed. But it wasn't the social movements alone that stopped these laws from being passed. Anybody who know why Wisconsin didn't pass these laws in 2016?
Cows got to be milked.
Cows got to be milked. Thank you, sir. The cows have to be milked. Wisconsin has the #2 dairy industry in the country. #1 in our hearts. #2 behind California. More than 80% of that labor is immigrant labor. The majority of that immigrant labor is undocumented. So at the same day that those 20,000 people went to the Capitol, dairy producers were picking up the phone and calling their legislators and calling the governor, reminding him who milks the cows in the state. And this is why the law did not get passed. This is a report that came out last year from the School for Workers. Agricultural workers are essential Wisconsin community members. They milk cows, harvest cherries and cranberries, prune nursery plants, sort potatoes, and package frozen or canned vegetables. Often having traveled to Wisconsin from long distances, agricultural workers establish themselves here, bringing with them their talents and skills as well as their hopes and dreams. With little recognition and institutional support, these workers are made invisible, even to the communities they live in and support. So we are 100 years into this history, friends. 100 years of Mexicans, and now Nicaraguans and Venezuelans and other groups coming to the state. Many of them coming for the exact same reason that European immigrants who preceded them came for a better life for themselves and for their family, for better opportunities, prepared to work, whatever they need to do to provide for themselves. So here's what I want us to think about. What is it that we need to do as a state to stop recognizing these people as newcomers only, as aliens, as foreigners, or as people that need to be rounded up and caught? What do we have to do, in other words, to recognize that Mexican Americans and Latinos in general are as Wisconsin as anybody else? Thank you. I just want to point out, right on the dot. All right, I was watching that clock. Check that out, all right?
If you have a question, raise your hand. We'll bring you a microphone so everybody can hear your question.
Thank you. One thing that puzzles me
Yeah.
is you started a lot like the importance of 1949, 1950 with the canned goods and the migrations and movement in. What happened during World War II when all the, we're feeding a lot of the world. We're feeding England, we're feeding Russia. A lot of the farm workers were gone and things. Was there not a push to get immigration during World War II?
Yeah, great question. That's lecture number 2, but I can answer right now. I actually just published an article with the Wisconsin Magazine of History last year about cherry pickers in Door County in the 1940s. So what happens? Well, here's the thing I didn't have a chance to mention. In the 1930s, Wisconsin's Latino population plummets. During the Great Depression, those immigrants are no longer needed. They are bought one-way tickets by welfare agencies back to Mexico. So some of you may know this period is known as the Great Repatriation. Across the United States, 500,000 to 1 million Mexicans were deported from the United States. 500,000 to 1 million within 1 decade. Many of them were not actually deported because many of them were American citizens who were born in this country but were deported back with their families to Mexico. So during the Depression, the country got rid of these people. But you're right, during World War II, we needed workers, including here in Wisconsin. So what do? There's 2 things that they do. One is that they look for migrant farm workers, but from other places. So they sign labor agreements. The United States federal government signs labor agreements with the Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, and Mexico. These guest worker programs, in Mexico it was called the Bracero program, started in 1942, went all the way to 1964. They also try to recruit poor Southerners, black Southerners and white Southerners, and they would bring them up here for the harvest season to do this work. In 1945, 46, 47, as the war was winding down, a lot of these farmers realized that those workers were too expensive. But because those labor contracts were signed with the federal government, there were stipulations in place that these workers had to be protected. In other words, to make sure they weren't abused, like Mexicans had been abused in the 20s, there were labor stipulations between these 2 nations, right? So there were actually Mexican federal observers here in Wisconsin to keep an eye on these labor camps. Wisconsin farmers didn't want that, so they stopped recruiting farm workers from Mexico and Barbados and Jamaica, and that's when they turned to Texas, because as we said, as American citizens, they were displaced workers, right? They were kind of the stepchildren of the country. Yeah, thank you.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
Do you know anything about the migrant camps in Watoma now, the working conditions?
Yeah, so beginning in the 1960s, these migrant camps, just at the moment that farm workers are organizing themselves into labor unions, a lot of the producers are starting to mechanize, right? They're trying to basically take care of the number 1 condition that's hardest for them to control, which is labor. Right? I mean, it's really hard to recruit people from Texas to make sure that you have enough positions for all of them, and so they're mechanizing. So just at the time that workers are getting power at the work site, there are fewer jobs. And so there's a diminution, right? I said 15,000 Texas Mexicans in the 1950s. We now have in the, under 3,000 migrant farm workers in Wisconsin now. And the majority of them are still coming from Texas. Some of them are also migrant farm workers from across Latin America. There are smaller numbers because they just need fewer workers in places like Watoma or Waupun or all across the state of Wisconsin. Their conditions, they're certainly better. They're better for 2 reasons. One, because of that labor organizing, but also because the state recognized they had an obligation to provide better conditions. And so you see a lot more collaborations between local organizations and the state, between organizations like UMOS, which was founded in the 1960s, United Migrant Opportunity Services. It was created by religious organizations taking federal money to make sure they could provide services. And then you have also things like health opportunities, right? Like health clinics all across the state of Wisconsin that are in place. They still kind of live under pretty rough conditions, and it's certainly not work that anybody in this room would want themselves to do or anybody in their family to do.
Will you talk about the role of the crew leader who brings migrant workers?
Yeah, crew leaders. Yeah. So I mean, this is they've had different names across American history. In the 1920s, they were called padrones or padrinos, right? And their number 1 role was to recruit workers. They were kind of cultural intermediaries. They were often people of the community who were subcontracted out to bring people up. And so in the 1940s and 1950s, the crew leader was the individual who would get people from the local town, bring up the cars. They would often work with a local farm here in Wisconsin to make sure they had the right number of workers that they needed for the specific harvest season, and they would facilitate their travel up to the state. We have examples of good crew leaders and bad crew leaders, right? So we have good crew leaders who were parts of their community and respected, and they really had the best intentions of the crew in mind. You also had crew leaders who were just trying to make a buck as an intermediary with the employer. And so they would sometimes oversell to communities back in Texas the opportunities that were available here in Wisconsin. Those families would arrive in Wisconsin and realize there were not actually jobs waiting for them here, and that basically had been hoodwinked on their way up to the state. And so they played really important roles. Crew leaders today, much less important because they're smaller numbers. A lot of that migrant labor is now regulated by the state, and so they play a much less important role within that economic process. Yes?
I picked cherries during World War II. I was a Boy Scout from Racine. I took the train from Racine to Green Bay, from Green Bay to Sturgeon Bay, and the bus to Fish Creek. And we lived in a barracks, slept on straw ticks in the barracks, and we had outhouses for other things. So I remember working in the cherries as a kid, as a Boy Scout. Also, I'm from Racine, and we had wonderful farming land in rural Racine in Kenosha. I weeded onions, I harvested onions, and I worked in sorting onions. And if you know anything about onions, not all of them smell good. So that's part of my experience. And there were a lot of other kids that were 11, 12, 13 years old who were working during World War II.
Yeah, the war was a really fascinating experience. You have to imagine here, of course, that the nation, of course, is like ramping up within just months the war machine to try to supply the agricultural produce that they need to feed not just the world, but specifically their soldiers. And so you have state institutions like the State War Board that is just trying to find labor as quickly as they can. The first thing they do is they go to family farms. That's certainly not going to work because a lot of the young men and young women have either gone off to fight in the war or have gone into cities to work in industrial labor. Then they look for these Boy Scouts. Sometimes they are productive workers, sometimes they're not. The state reports from 44 and 45 say, let's look at something else other than Boy Scouts. So then they look to migrant farm workers from across the Western Hemisphere. Those are pretty good. And then in 1945, the last group that they're able to grab, German POWs. So there's a large number, thousands of German POWs who have been brought to Wisconsin in 1945. They're living in war camps all across the state. They're given the opportunity, instead of just sitting in confinement, to go out into the fields and work, including in Door County, where they work alongside those Mexican and Jamaican farm workers.
Question.
Yes, sir.
A comment, first of all, the foundry here in Waupaca has hired a goodly number of Latino workers. My first question is, how difficult is it for them to bring them to Waupaca? And secondly, many of them, as young men, I assume, or mostly men, how difficult will it be for them to bring family members if they choose to settle here for a long period of time? And just a note on the POWs, there were 20,000 in Wisconsin.
There you go. So I can't speak to the specific issue here with the industry in Waupaca. It really does depend on the type of visas that these workers are being brought under. I'm going to make the assumption that they're being brought under labor visas, that they're not undocumented, because that is still the case in industrial and agricultural labor. Employers are still hiring undocumented workers, and they do that willingly and sometimes unwillingly. Again, the immigration and the visa and the work visa process is so complicated. There's so many different ways in which an employer could potentially bring in workers. When they're bringing in industrial labor, agricultural labor, they often have to show the federal government that they can't find local labor to do the work. That's the first thing you have to prove. You're not displacing domestic workers. And so if an industry is able to prove that, which is often the case with the H-2B visas and dairy work, right? They have these limited number of worker visas that are allowed for agricultural labor. Then they're allowed to legally go and recruit workers from other parts of the world, often from Latin America. but I don't know specifically the case. To bring their families, if they've been brought under work visas, it's very difficult for them to bring their families because they're being brought specifically to do one thing, and that is to work. Those visas are often almost always tied to their employer, which means that they're only in the country legally to work at the space in which they have been hired. Now, critics of guest worker programs like these will say that that leaves workers basically open to exploitation because they know that if they speak out at the work site, they can be sent back to their home country, and it's not like they can go get a different job at a different factory or a different foundry, right? So this is one of the criticisms that often exists, but I don't know the specific case here in town. Yeah. Yes?
Who takes care of their health insurance? Like us Americans, we pay for their health insurance?
Who specifically, ma'am?
Like that, like when I used to work at Wild Rose Hospital and all those migrants would come in there and we would have to take care of them. Who pays for stuff like that?
It depends. If they have health insurance, just like any other American, right? It's the same question, right? How do Americans who are working in factories who don't have health insurance get their health insurance covered? There's a number of different systems that can cover it, and sometimes people don't go to get medical coverage because they don't have access to insurance. So that's a very broad question. It'd be hard for me to answer, especially when you use the word them. The them can include so many different people. You're talking about a specific population, documented, undocumented, guest workers, not guest workers. So it's very difficult to kind of just say who is the they and who's paying for them. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for choosing the profession that you have chosen.
Thank you.
The question I have, you had put up a quote from Agnes Fenton.
Yes, my good friend Agnes. Yeah.
I had to stand up to see the date. I couldn't tell if it was 2024 or then I saw it was 1930.
Yeah.
What, in addition to bringing you here, what can the people from the Wapaka area do to make things better in this situation? What are maybe the top one or two things you would suggest we do?
I appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah. What did Mark Twain say? History doesn't repeat itself, but it sometimes rhymes, right? The first thing, you're doing the first thing, which is to educate yourself. There's nothing you can do without having as much information as possible. And I am but one voice of many people who are trying to educate the state about the history of Latinos, both in the past, but also when we say history, what is the history that remains in front of us, right? The future. Because this is a question that we should be thinking about not for the next 5 years, but the next 20 years. I mentioned that this population is the only demographic growth in most parts of the state, whether you want it or not. That is just the reality. So one thing I would recommend is to get educated not just in the history, but in the legal status, right? So if you could bring in a speaker who can talk to you about the legal intricacies of the U.S. immigration system, you will be floored. And you will realize that when people say these people should just get in line, the next question is, where is the line? Or when people say things like, my family came here legally, you'd be surprised to learn that the immigration system has changed a little bit since the 1920s. There was a time in this state. Did you know that in the 1850s and 1860s, the state of Wisconsin recruited immigrants to the state? We had immigration bureaus all across Europe actively recruiting people to come and fill the state. You could vote before you had citizenship in the state of Wisconsin, as long as you pledged to become a citizen one day. All right, this is all part of our state history. So get the legal intricacies in place. The second thing is to look at the organizations that are already doing the work in your communities, right? Whether it's churches or civic organizations that are doing outreach. Many of these groups have been doing this work for decades, right? So I talk about those religious organizations. In my book, I recount 100 years in which Catholic and Protestant groups have been trying to do outreach. Sometimes well, sometimes ham-fistedly, but still trying to build a sense of fellowship with these communities. And the third thing I would say is to just question everything you hear. When you hear stories about these immigrant populations that are overrunning our communities, that are sapping our resources, that are changing the face of our nation. Because you're right, sometimes it starts to sound just like Agnes Fenton sounded in 1930. I'm going to say microphone. I'm going to see if we can get some other voices to make sure we get everybody has a chance.
I was just going to say,
oh, yes.
You know, there are community clinics.
Yes.
Community organizations that will cover health care, both inpatient and outpatient. And the other thing is that many of our migrants now that have come up are staying longer and only going back to Mexico for 1 or 2 months.
Yeah.
They're really living here.
Yep.
But they're not a drain on our society.
That's right. You know, I'm going to make one really interesting point here. You know, the United States, since about the mid-1990s, has been working to toughen the border. Right? So under the Clinton administration, 1994 passed a series of laws that constructed a barrier and infused hundreds of millions of dollars into Border Patrol. Most of you might know that the largest law enforcement agency of the United States is at the U.S.-Mexico border, right? The irony, of course, about efforts to harden the border is, yes, it keeps people out, but it also keeps people in, right? And so you actually have had, over the last few decades, fewer back-and-forth migration like you noted, and so more people are actually settling in the United States. These undocumented populations that may have traveled across the border and may have gone back to Mexico to live find it impossible to do so. And so now communities are having to reckon with kind of the consequences of some of those policies. You are exactly right that some communities, like in Watoma, have been trying since the 1970s to build the infrastructure, right? They recognize that these people are here, they're working in those industries that prop up their communities, and they're trying to think of the way in which they can provide resources, especially when the federal government, the state government, maybe even local government is not going to create that infrastructure. Yes, sir.
Here in Wapaka, anybody work at the foundry? The picnic is August 3rd, but the invitation to the foundry that went to all employees, present and former ones, is in English and Spanish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Got one over here. Across the room.
Get your steps in.
I'm not an authority on this, but I know that there are Haitians working at the foundry and quite a few living in New London. And Hélène Paul is helping teach English to the French. She's from France.
That's wonderful.
And
Yes.
Larry Thomas over at the Tech is helping with a clothing closet.
That's phenomenal. Yeah, I mean, it really does speak to the question of the gentleman earlier about what we can do. Is, I mean, to also remember that there are different communities coming. I mentioned the Nicaraguans. There are larger Haitians populations coming over. Of course, Hmong populations that have been here since the 1970s and 1980s, but many of them still feel like aliens or foreigners in their own places that they've built communities for decades, right? So I think there's a lot of work we can still do in that way. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Also at the library for over a year now, there's a class that people from the foundry or any Spanish-speaking person is invited to, and those of us who once spoke Spanish and trying to learn again, we meet once a week, and it's open, and people are very welcome to come.
That's wonderful. I love it. Intercambios, that's great. Yes, ma'am.
And we have a few Haitian people living in Wapaka, and a couple individual women trying to find resources to help them learn English. They've asked to come forward and learn.
Wonderful. Yes, sir.
You indicated that the Hispanic population in Wisconsin is now almost 10%, over
Yep.
400,000 people.
Yep.
How does that convert for education?
Yep.
In terms of, I assume I suspect it's a younger group than
It is.
the average population as well. So a lot of kids in school. What's happening at the technical schools and at the colleges? Is there 10% of the students now Hispanic, or where's that going?
That's a fantastic question. Yes, this population is much younger than the white population in the state of Wisconsin. We are seeing the largest growth still in the younger cohorts, so we see large groups in the elementary schools. We haven't seen that bubble continue to rise up into the higher education space yet, but that will, of course, be the question over the next 10 years. And we have seen the state grapple with the question of how to provide resources and incorporate these students in different ways. So one, the state of Wisconsin in 1973 passed the Bilingual Education Act. So there are, and of course there is the federal Bilingual Education Act that has stipulations on language services that have to be provided. So that's already set in place. But then there are questions, of course, about documentation. So what about those undocumented students who live in the state of Wisconsin, who don't have access to citizenship, but have grown up their entire lives in the state of Wisconsin? Perhaps their parents brought them here when they were 3 years old. And they graduate from high school, 18 years old, and they want to go to one of our great state institutions. Or they want to go to technical college. They don't have access to federal money, to FAFSA, to loans. They don't have access to in-state tuition, even if they grew up in this state. They have to pay as if they were an international student. In 2009, the state legislature passed a law that would have granted undocumented students access to in-state tuition. In 2010, the incoming governor, one of the first things he did was to rescind that law. So that makes it an active question. So we think about the things that we can do, the little things that we can do, right? Think about the way in which you can transform the life of an individual who knows no other home than this one. They are Wisconsinite through and through, just by virtue of chance. They were born in another country. But their family, their friends, their community is here in the state. They're basically stuck in a dead-end position. So that is an open question right now.
I think we can wrap things up. Sergio has some books for sale at the front of the room. I'm sure he would entertain a question or two. If you can help stacking chairs, we'd appreciate your help, but please don't hurt yourself. And thank everybody for coming, and thank you, Sergio.
Thank you.